Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's PIER Economics Seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce Frank Smets, the Deputy Head of the Monetary and Economic Department and Head of Economic Analysis and Statistics at the Bank for International Settlement. Frank is a leading expert and scholar in monetary economics and central banking with influential work on monetary policy transmission, macroeconomic modeling, and the role of expectation in the economies. For today, he will present his latest paper, Decomposing Macroeconomic Sentiment with LLMs, that explore how large language model can extract macroeconomic signal from the text data, an exciting frontier at the intersection of economics and AI. We will have around 40 to 45 minutes for the presentation today. Any clarification question are welcome along the way, and then we'll follow by a question and answer at the end. So please join me in welcoming Frank Smets.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. My first time in Thailand and my first time at the bank. So it's really a great honor and a pleasure to come here. So this is joint work with Byung-Chung Kwon, Taijin Park, Urichai. I guess many of you know. He sent you his greetings. Who are all three colleagues at the BIS. And of course, views expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the Bank for International Settlements. This is part of a bigger research agenda at the bank, which I'm sure is also taking place here and many other policy institutions, where we try to see what can we do with these large language models in economic analysis, in the analysis of financial stability risks. I mean, as you know, these large language models is basically the third generation of tools that we can use to turn text into data. And once we have data, numbers, we can, as economists, we know how to use those in nowcasting, in forecasting, in analyzing financial stability risks. And so this is really about trying to see whether we can use these LLM models to basically construct indicators of economic sentiment, both on growth and on inflation, and particularly whether we can go beyond that and sort of also use these methods to see what are sort of some of the drivers of, say, expansionary sentiment on economic activity or of inflationary pressures. And so let me sort of give you an overview of the paper or the idea of the paper in a nutshell. The traditional empirical approach, is that we actually look at the data. Let's say GDP growth and inflation, CPI inflation. So that's what we get from the statistic office. And then in order to interpret those data, typically we put them into empirical models. Let's call it a vector autoregression as one of the simplest model. But in order to kind of interpret that empirical model, typically we have to use identifying restrictions in order to identify what are really the shocks driving these two variables in the economy. And so, I mean, one simple example of an empirical model would be we estimate the VAR, the vector autoregression on inflation and growth, and we impose sign restrictions to try to distinguish between demand and supply shocks, because we know for monetary policy, it may matter whether inflation is driven by demand versus supply shocks. So we impose restrictions on the VAR to say demand shocks are shocks that drive output and inflation in the same direction. So that's one sign. Restriction and supply shocks is the opposite. It drives output and inflation in opposite directions. And so then we have our VAR, and we can tell stories. No? So we go from data to stories. We do the decomposition of these two variables using our empirical model, and we say, we see that inflation is increasing. The model says, because it sees that at the same time, for example, economic activity is subdued, it's mostly driven by supply shocks. We can use that model to forecast, and we can tell stories about what's behind this decomposition. So that's traditionally what we do. Now, what we do in this paper is exactly the opposite. No, we start from the narrative, from the stories that are in the news. And more particularly, what we will do is we will use as an input Wall Street Journal articles. So it will be an application to the US. But that's text. No? So, as I said, the LLM is basically now the third generation of techniques that can put text into numbers. So we will use basically GPT, OpenAI, large language model to put these stories into numbers. And so actually what we're doing is exactly the opposite. So we go from the stories, we have our LLM analysis, which puts it in numbers, and we create data. And the data will be sentiment indicators in our case, but of course, there could be many other applications, and sort of what's driving those sentiment indicators. So we go from stories to data rather than from data to stories. And of course, I mean, in the end, this is what a paper does. So it's a very simple paper, as you will see. Now, in the end, next step of this research agenda would be also to marry the two. No? So can we use this news to identify the shocks? And to some extent, that's already a methodology that's out there. It's called the narrative approach to identification, where people say, well, rather than using sign restrictions, I know that on that date, there was a big supply shock. So use that to identify the shocks. So that's like a narrative approach to identifying the shocks. Well, so one question that in follow-up research we will look at is whether we can use this more systematic analysis of the news to also identify the shocks. But that's not yet where we are. So that's basically the paper. And let me just check. Now, the advantages of doing this part is that, I mean, obviously we're using another source of information, which is the news. In this case, newspaper articles, Wall Street Journal newspaper articles. One advantage is that it's really real time. So this methodology you can basically apply on a daily basis to whatever new articles that arrive. So you don't really have to wait for the GDP data to come to your desk. So it's a real time. It will be a real time indicator. It may also have information about, not about actual data, but about sort of news about the future. So again, it will not be easy to identify that. Again, we won't do that in this paper, but as a result, it may have some forecasting properties, either because it's news about some things that will come that are not yet in the data, or, and that's the other hypothesis, which is sort of Schiller's narrative economics idea. No, narratives may actually also define what's going on in the economy. If everybody is very optimistic because they think AI is going to change the world, then of course people invest, they start consuming because they feel wealthier, and so the economy is actually booming. So it becomes self-fulfilling. So that can also be a reason why looking at this news may have forecasting power. Again, we won't make that step in trying to identify the two different reasons why there may be forecasting power, but that's something to do in the next step. Okay, so let me then show you the outcome, or one example of the outcome. So we will have these 200,000 articles on economic and financial situation from the Wall Street Journal. And what we will do is we will look at separately at growth stories and inflation stories, try to distinguish between those stories. First of all, what's the sentiments, whether it's sentiment is that growth is increasing, expanding, or whether it's contracting, and same for inflation, whether inflation is expected to go up or inflation is expected to go down. And then within those stories, we will ask the LLM to say, well, is this more driven by supply or more driven by demand? And we will just, it's like a narrative restriction. We'll tell the large language model, if the stories tell you that economic activity and inflation are going in the same direction, then classify it as demand. If the opposite, classify it as supply. And so here you basically see the outcome of this exercise. These are the demand forces. The red one is based on the growth stories, and the blue one is based on the inflation stories. So this will be at the first step. We will first look at articles that are dominantly talking about growth. Actually, the way we will do it is by looking at the snippets, the headlines of these articles, and see whether inflation or growth is mentioned. And as you see, I mean, for demand, not surprisingly, because to some extent that's what we asked the LLM to do, there's a very high correlation between the indicators, demand indicators for growth and inflation. So when growth is expected to go up, which is when it's larger than zero, then also inflation is expected to go up. So the indicators, although they were constructed sort of separately, maybe not surprisingly, they're very highly positively correlated. Whereas for the supply indicator, not surprisingly, you get a very strong negative correlation. When inflation is expected to go up, like because of supply factors, like after the pandemic, with the global supply chain bottlenecks and the increase in energy and food prices, then output is expected to go down. In the output sentiment is negative. So correlation here is minus 0.55. I believe these are. So the basic analysis we do on a weekly basis. So we kind of look at all the articles within a week. Now then, of course, you can aggregate the indicators on a monthly or quarterly or annual scale. I think this is monthly. I mean, you see here at the end, I think this analysis stopped in April of this year, 2025. So we just got the Liberation Day event, which was clearly in the newspapers discussed as a big negative supply shock. Inflation sentiment peaked up, output sentiment peaked down. And so you can then look at all the events that you know of, but we'll come back to that when we look at then what is actually driving these sentiments. What are the underlying factors? Is it monetary policy? Is it consumer sentiment? Is it fiscal policy? Is it financial factors, financial exuberance, for example, that we will also be able to. So that basically is a preview of our results. As you said, if you have questions, just interrupt. And so more formally, that's what we do. So the data that we will use are Wall Street Journal financial news, economic and financial news articles. We access that through Factiva from January 2000 to April 2005. We have, over this whole period, 200,000 articles in this category. This is actually a category that Factiva, or I think the Wall Street Journal itself, sort of decides. On average, we have 600 words per article, so they're not big articles. They're relatively short articles. Then we will use the LLMs to parse this text data, and we'll have extract growth and inflation sentiment. So that's exactly what I showed you, but decomposed in terms of supply versus demand components. And then within that, we will look at different supply and demand drivers. I'll come back to that in a second. And so based on that, we will then construct these indices and their sub indices. And again, I showed you just an example. And what we do in the paper is, I mean, first of course, explain that, but secondly, then also try to validate what comes out of this procedure. Because, I mean, obviously LM, these are trained on basically the universe of data that's out there in the intranet. I mean, they're very much black boxes, no? So it's not, so you want to check whether what comes out kind of makes sense. And we do that in a number of ways. First of all, we'll examine the relationship with hard data counterparts. So some of these indicators, there are no other indicators that you can compare it with, see whether they make sense. We will compare them against some of the macroeconomic shock identified via models. Actually, this is particularly the monetary policy shocks, because there we do have big literature. And we also assess their forecasting ability. So can these indicators actually forecast growth and inflation on top of its own lags? Okay, maybe one comment on why the Wall Street Journal. So we had to make the decision. I mean, first of all, because if you have, there's many other newspapers in the US, so in principle, we could have looked at all the news on the US. We decided, at least in this first cut, to only look at one newspaper. Because particularly when you do a longitudinal analysis, so you want to look at this over basically 30 years or 25 years, we thought, first of all, the editorial standards of the Wall Street Journal are quite constant. So you always have more or less the same degree of attention. Of course, it depends on the news, but the sort of the quality of the articles and also the coverage is relatively constant over time. If you add other newspapers that are much more general newspapers, then this may include quite a bit of noise rather than signal. And so that's the main reason why for now we just, but of course, at the same time, by having only one newspaper, you may also have some biases coming from the editorial process of that newspaper. So that's definitely something to do. What do these indicators change if you incorporate other pieces of news? For example, from the wires, which we haven't done so far. Okay. So I told you about these indices and the decomposition. So basically, we use the LLM, the large language model, in 3 steps. And doing it in 3 steps makes it also a little bit more robust because you give the LLM sort of a clear set of instructions. I mean, the first step is actually to decide which are the articles that talk about growth and inflation. And for that, we use GPT-4, actually the mini version of GPT-4, and we let it run on these snippets, not on the full article, but basically on the headlines to decide, is this an article mainly on output, economic activity? Is it an article mainly on inflation? Or, and that we also allow to, are both mentioned? Then the article will be used twice. No? So in that first step, basically we go down from these 200,000 articles to about, let me just check to get the numbers right, to about 47,000 on growth and 28,000 on inflation. And so some of the articles may be overlapping when growth and inflation sort of appear in these headlines. So that's the first step. Then in the second step, we basically ask, and for this we use GPT-5, to assess based on the full article. So we give basically the GPT-5 each of those 47,000 articles, and we ask, say, okay, what's the sentiment? No? And again, for that, of course, you have a prompt, like you know how to do, where you basically say, if no economic activity is expected or is sensed to increase, then we say it's positive. If it's neutral, it's 0. If it's contractionary, it's negative. So that's the sentiment. and secondly, we also ask it to decide whether it's mostly demand-driven or supply-driven. By telling the LLM with demand, we mean a situation where both economic activity and inflation are expected to go up, and supply the opposite. And we give examples. So that's the second step, where we get these separate numbers, basically per article, which, so each article it could have either growth or inflation, or could be both. And then it's up or down or neutral. And then within the up or down or neutral, it's supply or demand. So that, please. Right. Yeah, I think we give it as an example. I mean, if it has growth or inflation, then, but I don't think it has to have. I mean, it's not a necessary condition to have it. Exactly. Sorry. I mean, in the paper, we give the exact prompts that we use, so can have a check whether what I'm saying is right. And then in a third step, so once we've defined each article and it has this this number assigned by the LLM model in the second step, then we ask, now you have this article, you basically said it's on growth and it has positive sentiment driven by positive demand developments. Then we ask them, they basically tell me, if you can, see evidence, whether the demand factors are more real versus financial, and within the real and financial, whether they're more private real demand or policy, basically fiscal policy, or between financial, where it's more private demand. So that would be like exuberance, financial exuberance, easy financial conditions, or tight financial conditions, or monetary policy. So public demand driving this. And the same for supply. So and then for supply, we have commodity prices. So that could be energy, could be food, materials, supply disruptions, and government policy, which is, we give examples like, tariffs, which we were mostly interested in, but could be also other structural reforms, supply side policies. And then we have a factor others here.
I'm wondering if you do any in-sample assessment of the classification in this step, like how good are the classification the model gives you?
So, I mean, we do two things. One is ex post validation by looking at how these indicators, because for each of those, we will have indicators compare with some other measures, for example, of supply disruptions. That's ex post. Ex ante, basically what we've done is randomly chose 300 articles and classified them using this system just ourselves. And then looked whether the LLM sort of came to the same results. And we get sort of a success rate of 93%. So it's very high. There's a 7% of articles, so the 21 articles of the 300 that were misclassified, I mean, or at least differently classified by humans versus the LLM, was not on these high level classifications. It was more on the factors behind it. So yeah, so we were quite happy with that type of test. Whether we had to fine tune. Well, I think in the end we did 2 rounds. So we had a first round where we had, I think, like 83%. So that was our first first draft and so on. Then we made some changes, particularly actually with respect to the role of financial factors, because some of the articles we had excluded because it was mostly on finance. And so we kind of included those. And then we again did, and then we had that. So it was not, so there was no iteration between, because it's quite heavy to do this reading of all these articles and the classification. So you don't want to do this 100 times.
Just a quick question. Just want to understand about how you define the sentiment from the news. Is it a kind of public sentiment or editorial sentiment or economic sentiment? Because in the news that, it's all over the place. It could be the public or,
Right. So it's really the sentiment that's in these Wall Street Journal articles. So that's really what the LLM looks at. And per article, it basically decides whether the sentiment is on growth and inflation, up or down, driven by supply versus demand. So it's really what the Wall Street Journal journalists think. In that sense, it's not public, it's not professional analysts, it's really the journalists. But of course, journalists' task is really to reflect sort of the analysis that's out there. And of course, many of these articles will also have quotes from professionals typically, and so that will also be used.
Define the main driver, like whether it's this demand or supply, you got the sentiment already. So I wonder if each bottom level driver can have like independent sentiment that is not the same as the main driver.
So when we're at this stage, basically we ask the LLM to give the main driver. So it could be, that they're in the article, there are different ones, but we assign the article to just one. One advantage of doing that is that then we can actually decompose our headline indices into these decompositions, the various drivers. But in principle, one could try to do it differently and, for example, ask the LLM to basically give these factors and say percentage, what percentage that we didn't do. Again, the more sophisticated you go, the more, I think, non-robust, because again, an article is a relatively small piece of words. And so far we found it useful just to say, give us what you think is, and of course, sometimes it would say none of these or it cannot decide. I mean, that's also a possibility.
So my second question is that for the supply side, how do you distinguish between other topics and irrelevant topic? Because I feel like the residual that you cannot classify as the first three drivers could be identified as either others or irrelevant.
Yeah, I would have to actually check what exactly we did, whether this includes also irrelevant or I probably it's just the residual category. But yeah, I would have to check in the prompt what we actually tell.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe we can go, well, before we go to the results, let me just reiterate some of the methodological steps. I mean, some of these things are already mentioned. So, I mean, as you know, what's key is the prompt. You have to have a sort of a prompt that allows the LLM to really get what you want. And so what I think are three important elements of what we did is first that we, I mean, obviously can explain. I mean, you always create the context. You basically tell the LLM, look, I will give you an article. You're an analyst, and I want to know this and that. But then you have to explain the concepts. So again, an example, you can see the full prompts in the appendix. But when we ask about assign this to demand versus supply, we say demand forces move inflation and growth in the same direction. I mean, that's the key element. So it's like a sign restriction almost that we apply to the text. Then the other thing that we found important is to give examples. So be as concrete as possible in giving examples. So, for example, real demand drivers include confidence, uncertainty, fiscal policy. So what we think as sources of demand shocks and demand developments. And the other thing that's important, also because we will use these indicators in forecasting, is that so every article is given separately to the LLM. So it's not that we give the full set of articles and then let them, so that basically every article is analyzed by the LLM as a self-standing piece. And then in terms of the construction of the sentiment index, so basically it works kind of from the bottom up to the down. So each of these individual drivers, you get basically, of course, it depends on the number of articles. But for example, you have in a given month, you have 5 articles that are on growth, driven by demand, driven by consumer confidence or the real private sector. That would be the number 5. We have that for each of those factors, and basically they add up to demand and supply on growth and inflation. And so that's the index that we get.
capturing sentiment. Have you overcome this problem?
I mean, not really, in the sense that, as I said, every article is treated separately, and it's the way we do it. It's 1, 0, -1. Now, again, you could make that more sophisticated and try to ask the LLM, is it very expansionary? Is the mood very optimistic, moderately optimistic, neutral? Again, there's limits, I think, to what you can do. The intensity will come from the number of articles. No, now again, Taylor Swift. To the extent that the headline has something to do with economic activity and or inflation, as it was. I remember, like, I think it's Sweden, no? Actually, economic activity, GDP numbers were affected by the Taylor Swift concert. So actually, that may show up. But yeah, there's of course limits to how, and that's why you need to do also the exposed validation.
Just wonder that why we use the GPT 4.1, because right now we have a lot of models in the market, and why we still need to use the mini version of the ChatGPT 4.1.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that this is mostly because of cost and speed. So if you have lots of time, I mean, because the more recent models and the bigger models, they just take more time. No, they may be more accurate, but they also make so it was that type of trade-off.
So what is the cost of we are doing in this paper for the cost of using the ChatGPT?
That I don't know. A good question. I should know as a manager, but.
So another question is about the article that we use in this paper. Sometimes the article is some kind like is linked from the article for the previous article, like how to explain it, it's like the first article is about what's happened in the first, and the second article is some kind about is the explanation of the first article, and so on and so forth. So just wonder that if we use the all article and some article are not some article are not independent articles for each other. So is some kind is making some bias in our context.
Right. Could be. I don't know. So literally, I mean, this is where the black box enters. No, we have these 200,000 articles of this kind, which are basically classified by the Wall Street Journal or Factiva as being articles on economic and financial situation. It's sort of, if you have Factiva, that's like one category. So that's basically given by Factiva. And then we use GPT-4 exactly because you don't need, I mean, we want to have sort of a quick classification in growth and inflation articles over those 200,000 to bring it down to 47,000 in growth and 27,000 on inflation. So again, whether as a result there are examples of what you're saying, that actually it's like one article which is somehow repeated, or that is part of two pieces. I mean, that I don't know. I mean, for that you have to actually go into and so we didn't check that. I mean, often in those cases, probably it means that it's more important, if there are more. And again, then the fact that we have 3 points or 3 articles rather than just one may be okay. But again, that's hard to tell. So I don't know. Okay, so let me just then show you some of the results. So I don't know if this is very visible in the back, but basically this gives you everything that we have for the growth sentiment. We have a similar, I'll show you a similar one for the inflation sentiment. So it shows you whether the sentiment is positive or negative. It's no, greater than 0, it's positive. If it's negative, then it's contractionary sentiment, pessimistic sentiment. And then the colors show you whether it's a demand driver or a supply driver. So blue and green are the demand drivers. Red, brown, yellow are the supply drivers. And as I said, they add up to the overall sentiment. So at any point in time, because they're different articles, no, you can have some positive, some negative, some demand, some supply, and overall they will give you an overall assessment in that week or in that month, depending on your temporal aggregation. I mean, just a few, I mean, we should make this a little bit more dynamic, but we're not there yet. To give you a few sort of pointers in terms of what does this really say now. I mean, you see the blue, the dark blue is quite dominant, no? In whenever big things happen, it's the dark blue. So that's the real private demand. So these are things like consumer sentiment, in private demand, investment sentiment. That's and it's mostly important during the recessions, no? The 2001 recession, the global financial crisis. Here you see the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area. So this is for the US, no? The COVID crisis and the big rebound after that, that's seen as demand drivers and mostly private demand. I mean, you have some positive fiscal policy, which is, or some fiscal policy drivers. So after COVID, there's positive, and typically in the recessions, you have some positive fiscal offsetting demand factors. So that's one element that strikes you. The other element, maybe that's a higher level, it's blue and green that dominates. So demand seems to be more important, according to this tool, than the supply factors. In terms of demand, you also see some interesting things about monetary policy, the financial factors. I mean, obviously it was big in the global financial crisis. So again, not surprising. If we wouldn't find that, probably we would be worried about the methodology. It has a little bit of that in all crises, but not so much. No, in the early 2000 recession, a little bit also in the COVID crisis. Then, if you look at monetary policy, the main sort of driver here we see is as a run up to the inflation in 2001. So the tightening of monetary policy is sort of showing up as a negative demand component in 2002-2003 period. Again, not so surprising. What about the supply drivers? I mean, you see some red and yellow everywhere, but it doesn't strike you as sort of systematic. What I'll show you on inflation is that their supply drivers are more prominent in terms of driving inflation. But we do get some sensible results in terms of, for example, supply disruptions, which were important following the, so that the orange one, very important following the pandemic, the global supply. And I'll show you that actually this indicator, this sub-indicator, lines up very well with other indicators of supply disruptions. And we do see government policy, and particularly tariff policy, showing up in a big way most recently. since the election of President Trump, and before when Trump was in office the first time. So that's the brown parts. There's not much to be seen. If anything, the brown part is positive in the early period of the period. So that's for growth, and you can do the same for inflation. Again, these things are done separately. Now, of course, some of the articles are the same, and actually that's something I don't know. I should check what is the intersection in terms of articles. I mean, the demand drivers are basically the same stories that you find in the growth. So you do see that there's negative impact on inflation in the global financial crisis coming from consumer confidence and the financial factors. There is negative impact on inflation coming from monetary policy. So these type of stories you also see in inflation. And it's, again, not surprising because we show that's a very big correlation between the growth and inflation components. What's different is now you see the red quite clearly, and particularly commodity prices. When there was the big commodity price, energy price increases, for example, in 2008, that kind of shows up. The fall in energy prices in the mid-2010s, the rise in the post-pandemic crisis, so they show up. And you also see, again, the tariff policy leading to higher inflation sentiment in the first Trump period, and then more recently at the end of the period. Again, one of the advantages of this is that, I mean, you can update this on basically daily basis if you want, or a weekly basis, and see how these things are evolving.
So just to clarify, what is the sentiment? For example, if the article say, I like that the Fed increased the interest rate, would this be the positive or negative sentiment to the inflation?
Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. I mean, obviously you have articles which, for example, say, oh, the economy is booming, the Fed is likely to raise interest rates. No? So how do you classify that? So basically what we tell the LLM in this case is you should classify it as at the highest level first. That should be prioritized. So if it says the economy is booming, it is a positive sentiment on growth. No? And so then from that, then will be a question, okay, is it supply or demand? In this case, it's likely to interpret it as a demand, no? Because interest rates are increasing. And then only it will be asked about these underlying factors. But indeed, that's the advantage of GPT, of the LLM models. They actually can understand the context, no? Which with the previous methods, I mean, I've used LDA, the sort of the previous generation of language models, and there it was actually more difficult to kind of really define that context and say. Okay, I think I probably should, although there have been many questions, so let me just continue. So I mean, then what we do in the paper, we go through each of those separate components and try to compare it with some other indicators to see, do they really make sense? Do they capture what we kind of understand from the history? Let me actually skip this. This is just the comparing the growth sentiment. So that's the highest level, and inflation sentiment with non-farm payrolls and with CPI respectively. And I mean, you see the indicators are much more volatile than typically. Okay, this is also because it's year-on-year growth, so it's kind of smoothed. But overall, no, you have a significant positive correlation. And if you look in the paper, we look, or I guess maybe I show it here at sort of the cross-correlogram. I mean, you see some, I mean, basically these are coincident indicators, more or less. I mean, here it kind of shows some leading properties, but again, given that these three, I think, are all year on year, it may be just more the result of the smoothing of the data we look at. This is the Chicago Fed National Activity Indicator. It's really a coincident indicator, and you see that the correlation is really, it looks like a coincident indicator. Same with inflation. Basically, you get a positive, significant positive correlation. Then we look at the components. These are the tariff component, no, the policy shifts in the supply factor. If you compare that to the uncertainty index, tariff policy uncertainty index of Caldera and Jacobiello, I mean, you know, that didn't show much until Trump came, and then Trump was re-elected, and so more or less our indicator more or less replicates that indicator. If you look at supply disruptions, here we look at the New York Fed's global supply chain index. Again, there's a very high correlation between ours, which is the blue one, and this New York Fed indicator. And of course, it's mostly the pandemic where you have this big change. And again, you can look at the variance. If you look at real private demand, you see that it covers, I mean, again, it's more volatile, and there are some periods where it looks like it kind of misses. Like our indicator said that real private demand sentiment was quite negative after 2001, which kind of makes sense. No, it was a big crisis. I mean, September 11th was a big shock. But if you look at actual economy, I mean, the effect was relatively small. So there are periods when sentiment runs ahead of facts. And again, that's one of the interesting questions we want to follow up on. To what extent is it a driver, or is it just an indicator? No, what's the causality? And of course, the causality will be two-way, but the question is whether we can go beyond that. This is the financial private demand indicator. I mean, I've already pointed that the important component in the global financial crisis. What we compare it here with is the change in financial conditions index. And again, there's a very high correlation. So overall, we're quite happy with how also the sub-indices correspond to some of the other indicators we have. And in the paper, we sort of show you all the actual correlation numbers. Okay. Okay, so one other thing, and actually let me maybe look at this one that we do. So when I started, I showed you, well, what the typical empirical approach is. You look at output GDP, you have identifying sign restrictions, you get a story about supply and demand shocks. We do the opposite. We take text, sentiment, we apply the LLM, and we get indicators of supply versus demand shocks. So now we can actually compare the two. How do our decomposition compare with doing the traditional empirical approach. And so basically that's what we do here, comparing our demand and supply drivers for growth and inflation with the decomposition that Boris Hoffman and Sandra Eickemeyer, Boris is a colleague of mine, have done for the US, looking at a big data set on inflation and economic activity indicators. And again, generally you see significant positive correlations. So they're for the big events, you get sort of the same qualitative tendencies. No, for example, the demand growth, you get all the recessions. Again, there are some deviations. For example, in 2011, our demand indicator goes very negative, although short-lived, whereas the VAR-based indicator doesn't seem to point to that. Again, this was the time of the sovereign debt crisis, which there was a lot of talk about what effects this would have in the US. So generally positive. The one where the correlation is not significantly positive, it's positive, but not significantly different from zero, is the supply driver of inflation, where, I mean, again, there are some of the important changes in inflation sentiment are picked up, but there are also some differences. For example, in 2018-19, where our indicator pointed to positive inflation sentiment, whereas the decomposition, the VAR-based decomposition, basically signaled still a low inflation environment. And similarly, after the GFC, our indicator actually said that, or indicated that inflation pressures actually normalized very quickly after the initial peak because of so basically energy prices now in 2008 increasing, whereas the decomposition of Eickemeyer and Hoffman suggests that this was much more persistent. So again, you can tell stories about that. It's not that one is right or wrong. So generally, positive correlation, getting many of the same stories are similar, but not a perfect correlation. And so one of the questions we now have is whether we can actually use our indicators to refine the identification of the shocks. Okay, I think I should probably stop. Let me just say that we also look at some of the other. This is the monetary policy sentiment indicator graphed against the change in or the level of effective exchange rates. Again, you can tell stories about particular episodes. We look to what extent our monetary policy indicator is related to some of the well-known monetary policy shocks that have been identified. And in general, there's a significantly positive correlation, but the slope is relatively small. It's significant, but slow. So the sentiment indicates about inflation. They are related to these monetary policy shocks, but as you would expect, they're not the main driver of sentiment. But it does suggest to me that we can actually also use our indicators to refine some of the identification of those shocks. Let me skip fiscal policy. Just tell you then, at the end of the paper, we try to see whether there's additional forecasting power in our indices on top of lagged values. And in generally, we do find some positive gains in the root mean squared error when we compare a local projection, which is just based on past in this case, past data of the Chicago Fed index versus a local projection where we add our LLM indicator. But the gains are not, I mean, they're significant in this case, but not very large. So, so there's some power there, but I think in the end, my reading is that our indicator is mostly a sort of a coincident indicator, which lines up very much with other coincident indicators, like the Chicago Fed. Same for inflation, some positive for PCE core inflation. So some predictive power, but mostly in the short run in this case. So let me just conclude. So basically, I mean, why do we want to do this? Well, we just want to see whether, this text that we have, whether they're useful for understanding the economy, doing economic analysis. And so in this case, whether they're useful to basically finding out what are the drivers of the sentiment that we see in the news. One advantage is that it's near real-time, high-frequency summary of macroeconomic information. So you can do this on a weekly, daily basis. It comes as a package, so you can just apply it, and you not only get growth and inflation, supply, demand, but also some of the underlying drivers. And it's still a question whether, this is just a reflection of what is actually going on in the economy, or whether there is some whether it goes beyond mirroring the data. Actually, the sentiment is a driver of the economy. And I guess in reality, probably there's it's a bilateral relationship. So that's where the quote from Bob Shiller in his book Narrative Economics come in. We have to consider the possibility that sometimes the dominant reason why a recession is severe is related to the prevalence and vividness of certain stories, not the purely economic feedback or multipliers that economists love to model. And that's basically the next part of our research agenda, to see whether, yes, can we actually, from those indicators, actually get the sentiment that is sort of independent of actually what's going on and maybe drive some of the economic story. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll run a few minutes late for the question and answer. So I'll start collecting all the questions first, and then Frank can respond. We have one question from the audience online. Feel free to open your microphone and ask. Nampu. Or in the meantime, I can pass around the microphone for, yeah.
Thank you, Frank, again. A new area of research for you. So there's sentiment and there's shocks, right? And sentiment are not necessarily shocks. So I wonder if you maybe thought about, some of the news stories often are driven by data releases. Say unemployment number comes out, industrial production comes out, even FOMC announcement comes out. Those are actually data that drives the news. I think we always try to look at the shock element, which is the unexpected component. So I wonder if, you could exploit the ability of this LLMs to understand the context by actually get it to extract the unexpected sentiment from the data release, just for the, on news purely related only to data releases. And then you could get a systematic series of shocks, per se. And I was thinking with your multi-policy shock, whether if you refine that, you may get a better correlation with those shocks. Have you thought about doing something a bit more, the unanticipated component of the news, per se?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely is a very kind of promising direction to go. I mean, there are different ways you go about. One is actually to combine this text information with the actual numbers, and for example, compare it and sort of purge the news components coming from the numbers, from the unexpected numbers from this. Or I mean, so that would be combining two sources. And of course, it's true that the texts are often around new data. Now, the LLM tries to get the sentiment around this new data, but as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a shock. You know, it could be a sentiment that's already or has been there, and so to tease that out, I think would be important. I mean, there is a paper by Drexler and Aroba that on monetary policy that uses some of the LLM tools to look at the Fed's internal documentation and try to see basically how that drives monetary policy shocks, because apparently that, I mean, has other new information relative to what is released. And so that's, I think, one. Now, again, I don't remember exactly what they do and how they do it, but I think that would be one example where you actually try to combine the two and then see what is the additional. So they I think you show that by actually analyzing the information in this internal documentation, you get a better explanation of the shocks. So the shocks are to some extent information driven. Then another one of the things we're trying to do is, or we want to do, is to use those indicators in the identification of actual VARs, because they are related also to the shocks. And if we take these indicators, this decomposition seriously, then basically we're saying, no, our supply indicator is related to supply shocks. Our demand indicator is to demand shocks. And so we can, in principle, use that as information then to see whether we can get better estimates of supply, demand, or monetary policy shocks. So the different ways in which one could go further. But clearly, at the moment, these are just sentiment indicators, so they capture many different things. The only thing that we are quite confident of, or at least we think is worth further exploring, is that it does give you this decomposition. I don't know if the hand is still up. No.
Okay, so my question is that, like, in these large language models, like, there are usually some randomness to it. So I would like to know, in your experience, have you seen something like when you put an article into it, like the first time it says it's positive, the second time it says it's neutral or something like that? And if you have, like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. I don't think we have done that systematically. I mean, for that you have to rerun the whole exercise, and it's true. These models are probabilistic, so in principle they shouldn't give you exactly the same decomposition. I mean, our hunch is that because you do this over, again, 47,000 articles. I mean, some classifications will probably change, but that will not change the overall kind of picture. I mean, you see that the indicator is actually quite random, no? I mean, there's a lot of volatility. And so, I mean, my guess is that if you, again, this is just a guess, but if you were able, at this point, I think it's difficult to do because of cost and time, but if you were able to do like a stochastic simulation, like do this 1,000 times, that some of this high frequency variability would sort of smooth out, and you will get an even better indicator. But I don't know.
Okay, so maybe last question.
Okay. I asked that have you ever tried to compare like your method like from LLM with the other method that calculate the sentiment? Like for example, like using the people to lead the news and people to show the sentiment, like using the economic student like to lead the news and to give the sentiment number, and compare to the other methods such as using the NLP like, to calculate the sentiment from the news.
So, sorry, using what?
Using the NLP, like natural language processing, like this is a statistical method, like to extract like the sentiment from the news. And I support that, like the LLM method, like may suffer the same problem as the people, like because if you use the people to lead the news that happened in the past, like we know that what happened in 2008, like we know what happened to the 2020, like when the COVID come, like we know what is the effect to the economy. So we may bet at that the news side have negative or positive, right? And LM like may suffer from the same bias that like they know what happened, like ChatGPT may already know what happened. And in this case, like if you use it to forecast like the economic, like in the past, like it may accurate.
Right.
But it may be problem like if you forecast in the future that we still don't know like what happened to the news, to the shock that happened today or that happened in last month, like that. What is the effect like into the economy? Okay.
Yeah. So I think that I mean, I don't think we've done what you suggest, but one of the issues, particularly when you think about forecasting, is exactly the model knows everything, and now we're trying to get indicators in great financial crisis. Is there's an in-sample exercise rather than an out-of-sample exercise? And we have actually had quite long discussions about that. I'm actually wondering what sort of econometricians and referees will say about that, because I mean, we try, and I understand this is often called information leakage. You're trying to emphasize with an LLM model that kind of have looked at everything for a particular period. Now, first of all, the LLM model is not optimized to forecast. No, the LLM model is just there to interpret texts. And so if you just give it an article in 2001, it will just interpret that text. So from that perspective, I think it's still fair to do a forecasting exercise. But I think it's an open question. It's an open question.
Okay, thank you so much, Frank, for the insightful presentation, and also everyone, the audience here and at home that join us and ask thoughtful question and engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.